If you're confused about VCE, scaling, or Atar, don't worry. Tons of parents and students are in the same position as you every year. And that's why today I'll be breaking it down in just under 10 minutes to make sure that you know what to expect, whether you're in year 10, 11, or even in year 12. Hi, my name is Saham and I'm a first year medical student at Monash University. I graduated VCE very recently in 2024 with an Atar of 99.75, which made me the Dux of John Monash Science School. I also achieved a 3200 in the UCAT, allowing me to get into medicine at Monash University. So without further ado, let's get started. So to start us off, what is VCE? VCE stands for the Victorian Certificate of Education, and it's basically your year 11 and year 12 studies that you complete in Victoria, and you get a certificate for completing that at the end of year 12. Now the most important thing that you'll want to know in VCE is that there are subjects which have 4 units each. Units 1 to 4. Units 1 and 2 are mostly your year 11 subjects, whilst units 3 and 4 are mostly your year 12 subjects. It is really important to note that whilst year 3 and 4 are year 12 subjects, students can actually choose to accelerate in 1 or 2 of them and do these subjects early, for example doing them in year 11 or maybe even in year 10 if that is approved by their school. The same can be done for units 1 and 2. And it's really common for certain subjects such as methods and biology, where students love to finish these subjects off early to reduce their load in year 12. Now there are some minimum requirements that you have to complete in year 12 or VCE in order to get that certificate. The first is that you must do a minimum of 16 units in VCE. This means 4 subjects minimum because each subject has 4 units. One of these subjects must be some form of English, for example English mainstream, English language, or English literature. You must pick 3 additional subjects that can be anything from what VCE offers. However, most students are actually doing 5 to 6 subjects, as 6 subjects is actually the maximum number of subjects you can do that will still count towards your Atar. Because what these 6 subjects do is they give you some safety and also help you boost your Atar, but just because you're doing more subjects will automatically count towards your Atar. Now, just really important note about doing those subjects early and accelerating, just like I did with VCE chemistry. I finished that in year 11. It actually depends on your school. Some schools allow it whilst others don't, and you actually have to perform well enough to show your teachers in the school that you'll be capable of doing well in that subject in year 11. Okay, so now let's talk about how subjects work, their content, their coursework, and what to expect. The most important thing in VCE is the fact that you'll be doing SACs and assessments the entire year. It starts in term 1, ends in term 4. This is like a marathon. I personally did over 40 SACs for my VCE subjects, and you will probably have a very similar number for yourself. Now, there's a quick distinction that I want to make between units 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Units 1 and 2 are more introductory. They're trying to get you to taste and have a feel for what the subject feels like, to kind of make you consider whether you would take it in year 12 or units 3 and 4. Whilst units 3 and 4 are really heavily assessed because they're counting towards your Atar and are creating that VCE that you'll be getting at the end of the year. There are 3 main types of assessments that you should know about, and the one that you'll see the most is SACs. SACs stand for School Assessed Coursework. These are SACs or tests that are done by a school which actually count towards your study score. The school will usually have 3 to 5 of these per subject, and most of these actually make up about 50% of your study score, whilst the end of your exams, which are run by VCA themselves, and the entire cohort that does these exams at the same time, count for the rest of your study score. Real important note, for SACs, VCA isn't looking at the exact percentage or grade that you get, it's more so your ranking in the cohort that you're in. The other really important assessment that you'll face is SATs. SATs are school assessed tests. These are what form your year 11 tests that your school is testing, and also some specific year 12 subjects such as studio arts, media, etc. Now the really big boys, the exams, or the end of year exams. All VC students doing a specific subject, for example methods, must sit this exact same exam on the same date at the same time. These exams are actually invigilated by VCA assessors and invigilators, and not your school teachers. And whilst your SAC schedule, content, and timeline might differ from school to school, the exams are extremely constant and they will be the same for everyone in the state doing that subject. And this is what brings me into the Atar, scaling, and how VCA standardizes your score to compare students from different schools that have different difficulties and levels of SACs and assessments. Now onto the part which you probably clicked on this video for, how to study schools, scaling, and Atar work. And so let's break it down step by step to make sure that you can get the whole picture. Now, just before we get started, I would like to make a quick distinction that VCA stands for Victorian Curriculum Assessment Authority, and these are the people who are designing the course and creating a raw study score. Whilst there's also another entity called VTAC. So firstly, study scores. Study scores are a score that you get between 0 and 50 for each of those Unit 3 and 4 subjects that you complete in VCE. Now note, study scores are not a reflection of your grades, they are a ranking. A 50 means that you were at the absolute top, whilst a 0 means you were at the absolute bottom. The average or mean for study scores is usually a 30. And these study scores follow a normal distribution, which you'll probably learn about in methods later on anyways, but you can search it up if you're interested. We can actually think of study scores as percentiles. A 30 is the mean, and most students will actually get around a 30. 15% of the cohort doing that subject will get a study score of 37 or higher. 9% will get a study score of 40 or higher, and only 2% will get a study score of 45 or higher. Now, what makes up your study score? As I said before, it's partially made up by those SACs that your school holds and the end of your exam that VCA does. And there's two real types that you can see here. For most subjects, 50% of your study score comes from those SACs, usually 4 to 5 SACs, depending on what your school wants to do. The exam counts for the rest of the 50% of your study score, which makes up your total study score at the end of the year. For maths, it's slightly different. 40% of your study score comes from your SACs, and 60% comes from your end of your exams, because there are 2 exams that you have to do for VCE math subjects. Now, subject scaling. There are 2 types of study scores that you'll get, a raw and a scaled. The raw study score is your ranking. For example, a raw 45 means your top 2%. And so what VCA does is it actually compares these study scores and these subjects and their difficulty to other subjects. For example, methods is generally considered a pretty hard subject. And so what VCA does is it looks at the cohort and their study scores in all the other subjects. It kind of sees that that mean of those other study scores is higher than the mean for methods. And so the difference in those mean study scores for these students in methods versus in other subjects means that VCA will now scale the study scores for methods up by that amount, for example, 4 study scores. And so your study score actually gets boosted by the scaling to kind of make it more fair for you doing a more difficult subject. This is the idea behind why students pick specials maths and Latin, as even though these subjects are really hard to do well in because they're difficult, they scale up by a lot. For example, specials maths scales up by 12. So if you get a raw 30, it scales up to a 42 as your study score, which is really good and will definitely boost your Atar. Whilst other subjects, for example, further maths and English, actually scale down. And so it really is kind of comparing how smart and competitive the cohorts are to reward you with the high study score if you did the harder subject. Finally, moving on to the Atar and how it works. So remember how you have to pick 4 subject minimum to complete VCE, and you can take up to 6 subjects? This is because those 4 subjects that you have to pick are actually going to form your top 4 subjects for your Atar calculation. Now don't worry, your VTAC is the one who calculates your Atar and your scaled study scores, and they will always pick your 4 highest scaled study scores to go in as your top 4 subjects. And what they do is they basically literally add up the numbers of these study scores together. So for example, a raw 45 in English, which stays as a 45 scaled, a raw 45 in methods, which goes up to a scaled 49, a raw 40 in specialist maths, which scales to a 52, and a raw 49 in accounting, which doesn't scale, all add up to create this number called your aggregate. Now note, those other 2 subjects that you did, that most students actually do as a bonus or a safeguard, aren't in vain, because 10% of those study scores are also added on to your aggregate. And for example, I got a raw 43 in chemistry, which scaled to a 46, and so that was my 6th subject, and 10% of that study score got added into my aggregate. So I got 4.6 into my aggregate from that 6th subject. So they weren't in vain, but they're not as important. What this does, it gives you flexibility to have these 6 subjects where you might not be as good at 1 or 2 of these subjects, which can now become your bottom 2, giving you space to do better without having to worry about doing well in every subject. After VTAC has added up your top 4 subject study scores and 10% from your bottom 2 subjects each, they create your total aggregate, which is then converted to your Atar. Now note, Atar again is a ranking. VCE is all about ranking and comparing students. Whilst which isn't great, it does help universities compare students for whatever course it may be. So once your aggregate is converted to this Atar, your Atar is now a percentile ranking. which shows you how well you did and how much better you did than the rest of the cohort. For example, I got a 99.75 Atar, which meant that I did better in VCE than 99.75% of the students doing VCE that year. Now the Atar is a percentile from 30 all the way up to 99.95, and it goes up in increments of 0.05. So you can get a 99.75 and a 99.8, nothing in between. And so now, after all that talk about study scores, scaling, and Atar, you might be wondering, so how do I know which subjects to pick? And so let me break it down to you about how I pick my subjects and what I think will be best for you to follow when you're picking up VCE subjects. Pro tip, don't try to focus on the scale. Here is how you're going to pick the perfect subjects with a very simple 3-stage rule. The first stage or step that I want you to think about is, what type of Atar do you want? If you want a really high Atar, then you're going to need subjects that you're really good at. Or, well, essentially this is what most people consider scaling. Does your subject scale a lot? If I get a 40, will it scale to a 52 like it does in Spec? If so, then that's a great booster for my Atar, and it will help me get those really high study scores that will help me boost my Atar to hopefully get into the course. But there's a really big caveat here, and that is, can you get that raw 40 in specials maths? It is way harder than you might think, so scaling, whilst important to consider, shouldn't be your only or key focus. Next up is trying to pick what you're good at. Maybe you're really good at maths, then you'll probably lean more towards methods and specials maths. Or you're really good at English, so you can try English and English language, taking 2 Englishes instead of 1. Or you can go to physics if that's what you like, or chemistry. This is kind of like a blend between what you're interested in and what you're really good at, because both of these are really important to make sure you actually firstly enjoy the subject. Secondly, you don't have to grind your ass off in order to do well. And third, you'll get the most out of the experience. Either that subject will help you towards a goal that you have, maybe trying to get into astrophysics, for example, through physics, or just really enjoy the journey instead of just thinking of it as a grind for SAC marks and scaling. And the third most important step is to look at your university prerequisites. A lot of courses require specific subjects with specific minimum study scores. So what I want you to do is go and use the VTAC course search to search these subjects up, see all their requirements before you decide on what subjects you want to do. What universities offer the same course, what Atar do you need to get into each of those universities, what are the subject prerequisites, and the minimum scores you need to get in those subjects. And use that to determine what subjects you're going to do in VCE to hopefully get into your dream course. Okay, so now, what can you expect in VCE and how are you going to tackle this marathon? The first thing I would like to cover is kind of like the VCE timeline and experience. It starts off quite chill in term 1, and it will feel a lot like year 11. It won't be that much pressure, you don't really have that many SACs. Most students have 4 or less SACs in term 1, so it's pretty relaxed. But as soon as you move into term 2, things ramp up. I had about 14 SACs in term 2. That is a lot. They're spread out through the entire term, especially towards the end. And that end is what we call the SAC week. The SAC week was about a week and a half of pure SACs. Every day I had 1 SAC, and within about a week after that, I also had my UCAT. And so you can kind of tell that the middle of the year, about June, July, it's an extremely heavy time period, which really tests students and will, at times, make you feel like giving up. But just know that every student is going to go through the same experience. It's really important that you keep going now that you have come so far and are already halfway through the journey. Soon afterwards, you might think that you're done, but no. Term 3 comes along and it is just as heavy as term 2. I had 13 SACs in term 3, but more importantly, exams are now coming up. By the time September hits, you should be deep in exam prep, maybe even starting in July and August. What this does, it will help you prepare and get the most practice you need for those exams in early November and late October. Because there is no term 4 in year 12. It's only 2 weeks before SWOT-VAC starts, which starts a week before your English exam. Then your exams go on for about 2 to 2.5 weeks. Now, how are you going to survive VCE, and especially year 12? The first most important thing that I applied in VCE was the fact that if you're failing to plan, then you're planning to fail. Planning and time management is probably the single most important thing you can do in VCE. Use every resource that is available to you, whether that be a Jolo, the book, practice SACs from your school, practice exams, any tutoring material that you might get from your tutor. Everything will only help prepare you to do better in both your SACs and your exams. Now I know what this sounds like. You might feel like you're burning out. So this is why cramming is something you should always be avoiding. If you burn out mid-year, it's not going to look too good towards the end of the year. And so this is why if you plan ahead, if you space it out enough, that burnout won't really happen, but you'll be more efficient and effective in your revision and preparation for whatever assessments that might be coming up. And one more really important tip is to get practice. Practice makes perfect in VCE. In VCE, it's all about ranking, which is based on how well you can do in questions. And the more questions you see, experience, and learn, the more likely you are to see questions you're familiar with in both your SACs and the exam. That's why really spam those practice SACs, questions, and exams, because the more practice you do, the better you're going to get. Because all VCE tests is your application skills. What it'll do is it'll take your knowledge and put it in an odd scenario that you have never seen before and ask you to come up with a solution. And that comes from practice. And finally, the mental health aspect. Again, as I said before, don't let yourself burn out. If you ever feel really stressed, which you will, talk to people about it. Talk to your friends, your family, anyone else who can help you out. Because if you bottle it up, it's only going to build up until you burst. And finally, sleep. A lot of students, sometimes me included, kind of ignored this fact, but sleep is extremely important, especially the week before any assessment, SAC, or exam. Because if you're not sleeping well, your brain is not going to work optimally. You're not going to have the right mindset. You're not going to get the answers to your head. You're not going to be able to think. And you're going to waste time in whatever assessment or exam you're doing, and that is detrimental. At that point, practice won't make perfect, rest will. So that's why sleep is extremely important. 7 to 8 hours every night, have a really good schedule, and try to stick to it. The more you stick to it, the better. But especially the week before any assessment or exam, stick to that sleep schedule. So that brings us to the end of the video. I just wanted to finish off by saying that VCE, whilst it's a grind, you don't have to be perfect every time. Not every SAC is going to go your way. Not every mark is going to be like your dream. But at the end of the day, it's not about you being perfect, because everyone is going to make mistakes. It's just 1 year of grind that might help build decades of great future. And so I would like to thank you for watching this video. If you really enjoyed it and would like to see more content like this, hit that like button to let me know that I should continue making more videos like this. If you're new here, my name is Saham, and you should consider subscribing, since I'll be making more content on VCE, my SAC strategies, how I did well, and how you can as well, alongside the UCAT medical interview, the whole spiel. And if you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments down below. I'll try my best to answer as many as I can. Anyways, that'll be it for this video. I wish you all the best for VCE, whether you haven't yet just started, or are deep into it. I recommend that you watch this video right here to get the most out of VCE. This has been Saham, and I'll see you in the next video.